What's going on, hustlers? So as you can tell by the topic of today's video, it's how to win friends and influence people. Why is this relevant, you might ask? Well, we have a loneliness epidemic. I believe it was the New York Times, and they reported that only 32% of adults over the age of 25 felt like they had any close friends in their life. So we have a loneliness epidemic. And then two, if you work in business, you need to sell people. Everything is a sale, whether or not you're trying to, merge car lanes or you're trying to conduct a, $50 million business transaction. You're selling yourself to people, and that goes back to influencing people. And then I also think that we live in a time now where with social media and then with the advancement of everybody's phones, it's crazy that we feel more connected than ever in terms of like information spread. But in terms of, actual human interaction, I think that's at an all-time low. So I think I have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tips. So I have 8 tips for you guys. So the first thing that I want to touch on, the reason why I'm qualified to speak on this, I've gone to 8 different schools, 4 different colleges. In all of my professions, I'm the youngest in the room, more often than not. And I have great relationships with people at every single school that I went to. If you watch the very, very first video that I posted on this channel, how I made 10K a month at 21, I explained how the relationships that I built led me to meeting somebody who didn't even knew I existed, but my ability to interact with people and influence people ended up leading to me having a life-changing conversation, which drastically impacted the trajectory of my life, simply based on the fact that I could win friends and influence people. Fun fact, every time I would get in trouble, my parents would make me read a self-development book. So that's actually the title of Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I read that book when I was 7 years old. It took me about a year to read it because it's like a 500-page book. And I was reading it at 7 years old because I kept getting in trouble. So they just kept making me read it. And then when I was filling out my reading log, the teachers were like, is he actually reading this, or are you guys like filling out his reading log for him? And they're like, no, he's actually doing this. So I've been consuming personal development, self-development stuff, business content since I was like 5, 6 years old. So that's kind of just a little fun fact. Now that I've established some ethos, the first tip is understanding body language. So body language, depending on who you ask, people will say it accounts for anywhere from 50 to 80% of human communication, right? So let's say you're having a conversation with somebody. One of the first things that I'll do is I'll look at the direction that somebody's toes are pointed, right? So when I'm people watching, right, or like I'll be on a date with a girl, and then like one of my favorite things to do is when we're talking, we'll see another couple, and then I'll be like, hey, listen, like, what are the odds you think that's their first date? And then she'll guess, and then I'll guess, and then she'll explain. She'll be like, oh, why do you think that? And the first thing I look at is the direction that the person's toes are pointed. So if the person's toes are pointed directly towards you, that's a great sign. That means they're open and they're receptive to what you have to say. Then you want to be very cognizant of what the person is doing with their hands, right? So if you're talking, and let's just say you're a guy at a bar, and then you're making friends with another guy at a bar, right? Or you're attempting to. If his toes are not pointed towards you, then the next thing you want to look at is his shoulders. So if his shoulders are squared away from you, also not a good sign that he's kind of reserved. Then you want to look at, their hands. Are they very expressive? Are they talking, with their hands? If they are, then that's a good sign. The next thing you want to look at, and this is going to be more of like a personal one, like if you're closer to the person in terms of proximity, you want to look at their eyes. So when people are interacting with things that they like or things that excite them, their pupils get really, really wide. And you'll be able to notice this from the first time you talk to somebody all the way through like 5-10 minutes into the conversation. That becomes pretty apparent. Then the next thing, if the person is like pruning themselves, and some people were like, oh, that's only like for intergender dynamics if people are dating, right? But if a guy like runs his hands through his hair, then that means he's fixing his appearance, because he might be conducive to whatever information it is that you're saying, or maybe he wants to portray a good impression, or if it's a girl, her fixing her hair, or something like that. So those are just like a couple body language things that you can kind of pick up on, that'll give you some insight into whether or not the person is receptive to what you're saying. The next thing is you want to ask giving questions rather than taking questions when you interact with people, right? So I think everybody's been there when you meet somebody and you're making small talk, and it's like, oh, where are you from? What do you do? Why did you move out here? Why did you move out here is not a taking question, but it's like, oh, do you have siblings? Like questions where it's like you're taking information from the person. You don't want to do that. It's cool like in the beginning, maybe for like the first 1 or 2 questions, but after that, 2 is like my hard limit. I don't ever ask any more taking questions than that. In terms of giving questions, I like to say, hey, you look like you know what's going on around here, or you look like you're having a good time tonight, or you're really excited to be here, right? So you want to give somebody like some positive affirmation in regards to the situation, right? And then typically people respond positively to positivity. So, I mean, if you're talking to a guy at the bar and, he's got a pint of Guinness and you're like, oh man, you slam that thing. I know you're having a good night tonight. Boom. Like, even if he's not having a good night tonight, he's still going to want to talk to you and be like, oh, not really. And then boom, that opens the door to have like an emotional conversation and then connect with the person. So you want to ask giving questions rather than taking questions. And then this third thing kind of piggybacks off of that. So you want to label people positively. And this is something that I use all the time in sales. Like one of the first things that I'll say after I get some information about a company, or I'm talking to, a contracting officer, is I'm like, oh, you're an action taker. You like to pull triggers. I like to work with people who pull triggers, right? And then I'll like parlay that by saying like, oh yeah, you like to move fast, and money admires speed. Wherever people are fast, that's where the money goes. So you want to label people positively. Shout out Alex Hormozy. He told a story about being in a frat where he was like, he was the treasurer, and then there was this one dude who never paid his dues. And he was like, yeah, I know you're a Super Bowl honorable guy. I know you're good for it. Like, I know you're immediately going to pay. And then 48 hours later, the guy paid all his dues for, the past 4 years of him being in a frat. Another example of this is kind of like in family dynamics, and this happened to me actually. So if, let's say it's a young child and then the child has siblings, let's say he's got 2 sisters, a mom, and a dad, and the child is the youngest, right? And the sister's asking for help, and then he's like, oh no, I don't want to do it. And then the sisters are like, oh, you're so selfish. Then the mom asks the child for help, and then the kid is like, no, I don't want to. And then, so the mom tells the kid that he's so selfish. Then in the kid's mind, he's like, I'm being labeled as selfish. So if I do anything outside of that, selfish is now my identity. So if I do something that's not selfish, or I do something that's selfless or helpful, then I'm going to feel weird because that like doesn't align with who I am. And that happened to me growing up as a kid. I was labeled that, and through no fault of like my parents, because I was selfish. But in this example, right, with the kid and his sisters, then the dad comes along and then he's like, oh man, you're super helpful. You're awesome, bud. I would really appreciate it if you came and spent some time with me as we worked on the car, right? So now the kid has been labeled as awesome. He's been labeled as helpful. So now he wants to go spend time and, help his dad out because that's what he's been labeled as. That's how he now identifies himself as in relation to his dad. So you want to label people positively. And then the next thing is you want to talk to people about themselves. So that's everybody's favorite topic in the world. I mean, I think I could sell, sand to a beach. I could sell ice to an Eskimo. And even when I know I'm being sold, sometimes I'll still bite just because I know somebody's getting me to open up and talk about myself. Everybody likes to talk about themselves. They like to talk about their story. They like to talk about where they're from, what their interests are, what they do for work. Maybe what they do for work. But, everybody likes to talk about themselves because that's what they know the most about. And people like to feel knowledgeable in conversations because then it helps them feel like they're in control. So talking to people about themselves One of the things that I do when I'm on the phone is I never make it, or when I'm trying to get a quote for, government contracting, I never make it about me getting a quote so I can sell stuff to the government. I always frame it as I'm trying to drum up some business for you guys. And then I'll ask, how long have they been open, where they're located, their owners, what's their story, how they get their start. So people love to talk about themselves, so talk to them about that. And then another thing, the power of knowing people's names. So immediately I will repeat somebody's name the first time I hear it. Like, I'm like, oh, what's your name? And then she'll be like, Sarah. And I'm like, oh, Sarah, it's a pleasure to meet you. And then my goal is throughout the course of the conversation, I want to say that person's name 3 times, because then it shows that you're attentive, it shows that you care. And 3, it also helps reinforce the fact that you actually know their name in your own mind, right? If you say Sarah 5 times over the course of, a 10-minute conversation, you're going to go home from that networking event later that day and you're going to be like, oh yeah, I remember Sarah. So ask people their name, and then my goal is to repeat it 3 times. If you can do it more, do it, but you don't want to like overdo it. Say it 3 times, but like in the normal flow of conversation. Don't like force it in there, because then people can sense that, and then it's like kind of weird and like off-putting. And then make people feel like they came to the decision on their own. So this has to do with influencing people. So when you want to, get somebody to do something, right? Like if I'm trying to get one of my buddies to go on a run with me, I'm not going to mention why I want him to go on a run with me, but I'm going to mention the fact that he told me he wanted to, get leaner, or he told me he wanted to start running. And I'll be like, oh, bro, I thought you said that, you wanted to really pick up running this year. I think maybe it would be like beneficial if you did. And then I'll reference that person's motivations or that person's goals. So then once you plant that seed in their mind, then they're a lot more apt to agree to whatever it is that you pitched, because you related it to them. And then the next thing that you want to do is you want to ask emotional questions. You want to ask probing questions, right? So I think the easiest one, and like my favorite one, is just, oh, how does that make you feel? Or like, did that make you feel good? Or how did you feel about that? Like, that's, I think, the easiest one. That's the best example I could give. You can use it in every single situation, right? If a guy's talking to you at a networking event and he's like, oh yeah, a deal fell through with the company, I'm like, oh man, how did that make you feel? Like, what was the morale like after that? Like, I'll always ask probing questions, but emotionally probing questions, right? That's how you can kind of, build a connection with somebody. And then once you can appeal to somebody's emotions as well as their interest, your probability of closing the deal, closing the sale, or getting, that person's number, or creating like a relationship to network with goes up exponentially higher. And then the last thing, which I think is probably the most important thing in terms of, influencing people, is like repeat what they said, right? So I'll be on a sales call and then I'll take notes based on like, what people are telling me about the status of their company, or, if I'm dealing with a government contractor, like a contracting officer, they'll tell me, they're like, oh man, like we've been trying to find this part forever, and the last company that we had, their quality assurance wasn't good, right? So I'll write these things down, and then like probably maybe like 5 to 10 seconds after we pivot from the conversation, I'll be like, wait, just so I make sure I have this right. You were telling me that the last company that you had, like they were not good with quality assurance, right? Or like if you're talking to a guy at the bar, you're like, oh man, you're telling me that, she cheated on you? Oh, that's terrible, right? So that makes people feel like you're listening. And it's not like a make them feel as in like it's disingenuous. You are listening. You have to listen because, you had to take the information, listen with the intent of understanding rather than responding, and then, take note of that to respond. And I think all the tips that I just gave here, they're really, really good for making sure that you change your perspective as you interact with people, from listening to respond and say what you need to say, rather than or to pivot into, listening to understand and, connect with the person on that level. So just to kind of recap, you want to understand body language. You want to ask giving questions rather than taking questions. You want to label people positively. You want to talk to them about themselves. You want to repeat their name. You want to make people feel like they came to the decision on their own. You want to ask emotional questions, and you want to repeat what they said. So that those are my 8 points on how to win friends and influence people. It's kind of just a little fun fact about, my experience in this space. So I hope you guys use this information to go out there, make some connections, network. Maybe it lands you a date, maybe it closes you a business deal, or maybe you just make, a new friend or an acquaintance, somebody that you see at the gym or that you see that grocery shops at the same time as you that you can have a conversation with. So, everybody feels a little bit less lonely.